So we might think about folio thinking, perhaps, as students' awareness of their learning positions. And as they move through the learning positions, they encounter what we would call transitional experiences. And these are experiences that are a shift in their learner experience, and not only in the context of a course, but they pose challenges to one's life world in particular areas at different times and in distinct ways. And e-portfolios have the opportunity to move students through this so that they have the ability to identify these learning positions and what they mean in that trajectory and how they make meaning out of that. What is this transitional place I'm in right now? For those of you who are familiar with research and threshold concepts, in threshold concepts, which are sort of bottlenecks in understanding in certain disciplines in order to get at the next level, those bottlenecks, and when students are moving through those threshold concepts or bottlenecks, they're often described as being in a liminal space. And perhaps the liminal space is not a place that they want to stay in, but you want to get out of that. I think there's an alternative view of a liminal space, where perhaps the liminal space is a place where you actually want to take advantage of that. And you want to take advantage of the fact that you're in this place and you're in a bottleneck, and it allows you to unpack your thinking and take a moment to reflect and start asking questions and valuing those questions rather than trying to get out of that space. So transitional experiences then can lead to transformational learning, because as you're transitioning through these places, then transformation involves a sense of coming into oneself and a sense of identity construction. And in many of the talks this week at this conference, I think we've learned a lot and discussed a lot about the development of identity through e-portfolios. And I know Brett and Lauren also talked about identity and how critical this is in those aspects of what e-portfolios are able to do. And so I think that if we're talking about identity construction, it's just as important for students to think about uncertainties in relation to that identity, because sometimes they feel pressured to become A, or to develop the skills to become X, Y, or Z. And there's so much certainty in that, and there are these concrete requirements and skills and abilities that are associated with that. But how do you make your own path, and what does that look like? And as identity formation, how do you relate that? How do you relate becoming a professional X, Y, or Z to who you are and your strengths as a person? Those attributes that really are going to be the most important for lifelong learning. And how do you create your own identity in relation to that? So one could say that building personal knowing can be related to building collaborative knowing through a process like a collaborative e-portfolio. Because the two are really, really in gear with each other. Because as you interrogate and interact with others, that social pedagogy, in thinking about what do we know and how do we know, it goes back to your own personal epistemologies and saying, okay, well, what do I know? What are my learning positions? What are my bottlenecks? And how do I relate that to where my colleagues or my peers are negotiating? Often in interdisciplinary communities, those social pedagogies are terrific, and they really help us unpack some of our assumptions. But in that process, how are you reflecting on your own individual identity and thinking about the unknowns and the questions that you might have in relation to that? So, over the course of this process, we found that the ideas were indeed evolving cyclically. And the students were reflecting and contributing to an iterative dialogue. There was definitely exploration beyond the formal course, and that was what was meant to be, because that e-portfolio was at the center of all the activities that were happening Therefore, we thought, well, wouldn't it be great if they actually were thinking in this way beyond the context of microbiology? And sure enough, they started to make meaning out of other things that were happening in their life in relation to this. And why do we know this? We know this because we had the transcripts from the discussions. They also were keeping what we called a bug book, which is not the formal laboratory notebook, but a blank, and I don't want to call it a journal because it wasn't necessarily meant to be something that was purely a journalistic endeavor, but it was a blank book that students were encouraged to write anything they wanted to in relation to the course and their investigative process. So sometimes they were very reflective and they had journals in them, but sometimes some students who were double microbiology and arts concentrators just filled them with illustrations or newspaper clippings. And so those started to look a lot richer because they were really bringing in things that were happening in their lives, or food poisoning that some cousin got, into what they understood in the process of learning about these different microbes. And they were starting to become comfortable with not knowing. They started to celebrate questions. They weren't afraid to ask questions. We were getting a lot more questions in the course, in the lecture, in the tutorials, in the WebCT discussion forums. And there was also a sense of self-authorship that started to develop. It was interesting. It was more group self-authorship rather than poignant moments of individual self-authorship. And so there was a group identity that started to form throughout the course, and I think that was reflective of the team's identity in how they saw themselves moving through. I'll show you one of the e-portfolios so towards the end of the semester, in their last version of the e-portfolio, this particular group they had decided to create a timeline. And for version 1, they described, well, okay, so the resources that were important to us, and of course they were on the web, and they used their textbooks, and their TA was also the resource. And then you start to see a transition, because in the middle of the course, they were only using peer-reviewed papers, and they had realized that no, we were going to go to the primary sources and decide which ones were going to be relevant to our research. But what I love is at the end they said, no, it's about us. We became incredible resources for each other, and we were solving each other's problems. We were able to work together, and we coalesced, and there's this identity that developed amongst the group as we are microbiologists. So, and there was great joy, which is not a word that I had used to associate with this course, but there was joy amongst the students, and they were quite chuffed and proud with what they were doing. So, if we think about e-portfolios as potentiating reflection and analysis of learning positions, then one might say, well, why are these spaces important? Why are transitional spaces and uncertainty important? If we're trying to create students who are going to be employable, and they're going to come out with these kinds of skills, and they need to show things to employers, and we're trying to, we are thinking about developing portfolios that could potentially be job portfolios. Why in the world would you want to show uncertainty? So we don't show uncertainty, certainly to an employer. But what we're doing is, through this process, we're cultivating those habits and minds and skills that employers do want. Because if we think about what kinds of students make it through, and particularly because I'm a scientist, I'm deeply, deeply committed to and concerned about the retention of students in STEM, because it's become a crisis. And with students who are underprepared, sometimes there are circumstances beyond the actual immediacy of the course, or courses they've taken and what preparation they have, that are going to impact on whether they stay in STEM after that first year in university. And so the development of competence in metacognition and learning to learn is absolutely critical, because what these things do is they help to form a learning identity and purpose in our students. And they develop learning power. And Ruth Deacon Kirk has done some great work in this area. And by learning power, amongst those attributes of learning power include things like resilience and creativity and curiosity. So what is it that we're intentionally doing? And what does that evidence look like that this is indeed developing in our students? Generating knowledge and know-how and applying learning in authentic contexts is also potentiated through the process of metacognition. And then finally, because we're talking about social pedagogies, sustaining these learning relationships is incredibly powerful for students beyond the immediacy of the course. These kinds of learning relationships and the abilities to do that will serve them well throughout their university careers as well as in the employment sector. So, in order for this to happen, they happen over sustained attention, right, over time. So they certainly don't happen within a single course or a single assignment. This has to happen throughout their years of education in different ways, in different disciplines, in different contexts. And so what are the ways in which we're scaffolding this? And how do we make this visible? And how do we value it? And I hate to use the A word, but how do you assess it?